All right, we are live with the last panel of the day. So I believe trapped inside every one of your companies is a bunch of data that in aggregate today could create transformative products that could completely reimagine your businesses. Or put another way, I believe that there's data exhaust of your businesses that should be corporate startups. And I've seen this up close and personal with a lot of the projects we've worked on at CSL. However, I really believe we're just in the first inning of figuring this out. And so I wanted to just, at the beginning of this conference here, have a conversation around doing this. And I have 4 amazing panelists to do this with me today. Actually, I have 2 right now, but 2 more are on their way in with some tech challenges in this Zoom world that we live in. But we've set up 4 panelists to talk about this today. And it's really Rebecca Nugent, who's a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon. Rebecca runs the data science program at CMU. She's modest, so she won't say this, but it is undisputedly the number 1 data science program among all the universities. And then I have Gustavo Lopez, who's at MSA and has built one of these database corporate startups himself. And then joining us in a minute, once we get the tech figured out, we'll have Tim Murphy from Philips and Pamela Peel from UPMC. So maybe, Rebecca, we'll start with you. If you could just do a quick introduction for yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Sean, for having all of us here. It's always a pleasure to participate with the Corporate Startup Lab, especially this particular forum. And I really want to encourage everyone who is joining us as an attendee to stay connected to the CSL and to Carnegie Mellon. There's all kinds of good opportunities to leverage, even if it's networking, sharing ideas, etc. So thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Nugent. I'm the Associate Head in Statistics and Data Science at Carnegie Mellon. As part of my portfolio, I oversee we loosely call it a corporate capstone program in our department, as well as some data initiatives for Dietrich College, which is where our department is located. This program is an experiential learning program that puts students and faculty on data science research projects with corporate partners, nonprofits, government, social organizations, et cetera. We've worked with anyone from 6-person startups through Fortune 100 companies. That's why I'm here talking about database corporate startups.
Awesome. Thanks. And Pamela, I'm going to have you go next, just so we can also use this as a mic check. So go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a fabulous opportunity. This is a great panel. I hope everybody really sits down, glues to it, get yourself a drink of water. This is going to be a fabulous panel as we come into talking about corporate startups. It's a great topic, by the way. I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you. And Pamela, your role at UPMC is the Chief Analytics Officer, correct?
So I am the Chief Analytics Officer at UPMC on the Insurance Services Division. As you know, we're we're the second largest integrated payer provider in the country, second behind Kaiser. And I'm the UPMC's Chief Analytics Officer at Enterprises. Enterprises, as I know you're well aware, is our venture capital and startup arm, which is quite large at UPMC.
Awesome. Gustavo, want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so thanks, Sean. Thanks for the opportunity. So glad to be here, everybody. I'm Gustavo Lopez. I am one of the general managers at MSA Safety. So MSA Safety is a company that's headquartered right outside of Pittsburgh in Cranberry Township. It's over 100 years old, 104 years old, solely focused on protecting people's lives day in and day out. So with personal protective equipment, and now we're doing it obviously with some software services around that. So, a couple of things just about myself. I am a Tepper alum. I graduated there in 2009, which is a little crazy to think about. But we've had some experiences working with CSL. So, 3 or 4 years ago, we started a project to really look at transcending the business model of MSA, how we go to market, some of the value there. We sponsored a class with Corporate Startup Lab. And then through that, had some great ideas and really were able to launch one of these corporate startups, which right now it's in its second, going on its 3rd year of existence there. So I'll give you a little bit of color of that later on. So I'm looking forward to sharing some experiences, and thanks for having me.
That's awesome. And Tim Murphy is still joining. So when he comes on, we'll have him out a little bit more. But Tim is part of the Philips Respironics team and has been part of originally Respironics, which ultimately was bought by Philips for over 20 years. So let's get the conversation started, Rebecca, with you. And just for the audience as well, if this is the first of the panels you've been in today, please do use the chat. We want to talk about what you want to talk about, not what we want to talk about. So we'll be monitoring the chat. But maybe, Rebecca, to get us started, if a company's trying to understand their data assets, what would you encourage them to do first?
Oh, that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, thinking about that corporate capstone program, when we interface with all kinds of different companies, when people think about managing and leveraging their data or bringing data science into their enterprise, it often seems really daunting. So people hear terms like, I'm going to build a data lake and I'm going to fully integrate all of my data systems and I'm going to build a fully automated pipeline where the data is going to feed in and flow and be beautiful. And first of all, it's never like that. So don't worry. If you are having issues thinking about data, so is everybody else. Everybody's thinking about the same kinds of questions. And one of the things we often do with our partners is sit them down at the very beginning and almost have them do kind of what I might call like a data inventory. And so oftentimes people aren't even aware of all of the information that they're already storing, or how people might even be creative with that information. So sometimes people will bring us an idea. Sometimes they bring us a data set and we walk through and we say, okay, where did it come from? Why do you even have it? And these are just verbal conversations. This is not technical coding or computer. This is actually just talking about data and thinking about its origin, why people have it, getting other people to ping ideas off of how you could even use it. Those kinds of conversations can be really helpful as you're starting to think about leveraging your data, because often people just kind of think, well, let's just store everything and kind of figure it out later. And that I think is very overwhelming for a lot of people. And you end up storing things you don't necessarily need, and it causes lots of integration problems, et cetera. But sitting down and asking your employees, how do you use information on a day-to-day basis in your current role? What information do you think you're missing? The other thing I'll add to that data inventory is we see over and over again that one group's data, when we talk about one group, maybe within an enterprise, they're talking about some data, and all of a sudden another person, say in another division or another silo, says, oh my gosh, have you ever thought of using it for this? And it's like you watch the light bulbs go off because they're being creative about how you might use data. And I've seen brand new products even being developed just verbally right there from communicating about the data sets and the data sources that you have. So I guess I would just say high level, kind of a data inventory. And again, that's not a super technical thing necessarily, but trying to communicate about what you have, trying to understand where it came from, and then kind of deciding what you need and then moving forward from there. But I cannot emphasize enough, that has been some of the most impactful work we've helped companies do.
I guess before we move on, both Gustavo and Pamela were sort of like nodding their head as you were talking. So I feel like I ought to, before asking the next question, give them a chance to jump in. So maybe Pamela, you first, and then Gustavo.
So thank you, Rebecca. That was very well articulated. And I think one of the problems that people encounter, and Rebecca spoke to this, is we are often using data for purposes they were not created for. That's particularly true in healthcare, where we're using transactional data called medical bills to do population health management and other things. Those data were not created to do population health management. They were created to get paid. And so when we do that, trying to understand the nuance of the data is incredibly important. And the first thing, don't go hire 15 data scientists for gazillions of dollars. You have to make your data fit for consumption. And so you have to know what you need to consume data for, to Rebecca's point. You don't need the entire universe of stuff. You just need to know what you are doing. And I absolutely, making your data fit for consumption, knowing what data you have and making it fit for consumption is step one.
Gustavo, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound a little bit silly and intuitive, right? But start with the customer problem, at least for us, right? I mean, you collect so much data, but if you don't know the underlying issue that you may want to solve, you can easily get into just paralysis by analysis, or just so much. And you can collect so much data from so many sources. One of the mistakes that I think, when we started in our journey that we made, it was let's collect everything. Well, we soon found out, well, that's just not going to work. If we want to solve this particular issue in this domain, here's what's going to help us. And then we were able to really just triangulate on where we really wanted to go.
Cool. Just for all three of you guys, feel free to jump in as well. I feel like this is one of the challenges from doing these where you're sitting next to each other versus the Brady Bunch 4 tiles, but pretend like you're next to each other and just go ahead and jump in. But Gustavo, I do think that your Safetyio corporate startup is a really good example of what I'm talking about monetizing data exhaust. So maybe talk a little bit more about what Safetyio is, how customers have reacted to it.
Yeah, so Safetyio is an idea that we really started about 3 years ago. Again, we're a safety manufacturer that makes anything from hard hats to portable gas detectors to fall protection harnesses, anything that protects people's lives day in and day out. And one of the things that we've certainly been finding out, all those gas detectors that people are using on a daily basis are collecting all sorts of data and information about their environment, the health and safety of the individual. And you can turn a safety program from a very reactive safety program to a proactive safety program. So we tried to do some things internally to try to advance that mission and try to do things. And quite frankly, we got a little bit of we had a hard time getting support just within the organization because we're a $1.4 billion enterprise. Get something off the ground that doesn't exist is difficult. And that's when we decided to do this corporate startup. And through that, we developed, a cloud-based software where you can take all of the connected devices and offer, services around, asset management or fleet management or also live monitoring. So as people are walking around a facility, you can then provide better insight as to, when their product alarms, how quickly did they respond to it? How quickly did you, write your reports and all of that good stuff. And, from an MSA perspective, we have kind of an unfair advantage in terms of going into a space that I think all of us in this day and age realize we're going to get to is, we have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of devices out there. So we were able to come up with a system to connect them and leverage the installed base that we have out there. And really the response has been, it started off relatively slow over the first 6-9 months, just what you would expect as you're building the business. But we kind of seen an explosion over the next 9-12 months. And, really, as you look at certainly the pandemic and COVID and everything has really accelerated the need to be able to provide some of these remote working tools. But we're now starting to see some of our customers really starting to make decisions based on the insight that we're providing them, which is really cool. Sets us apart and really, it also helps us, from an industry perspective, we're advancing how safety is perceived, right? It certainly is a necessary evil. I mean, health and safety probably isn't as prevalent as ever as it is now with certainly what we're living through. But tools like this are only going to get that much more critical. And, the fact that we have this little sandbox in there that we're growing and that we're able to do it under the umbrella of a much larger organization has really helped us gain some scale in a pretty tough environment right now.
Yeah, I think both MSA and UPMC, like you're good examples of this. I just want to highlight for a minute, right? So there are pockets of innovation that actually are easier to commercialize for a variety of reasons with the incumbency advantage, right? So I remember when Gustavo first told me about Safetyio, and it resonated with me on a lot of levels, right? So he didn't mention this, but one of the things I think is cool about MSA is it was started by Thomas Edison, like the Thomas Edison that you're thinking of 110 years ago, right? And originally, MSA stood for Mine Safety Appliance, right? It was like you've heard of like canary in the coal mine, right? It was an appliance for telling people when to get out of the mine, but it was an appliance instead of a canary. It turns out appliances are better than canaries at that. Who would have thought, right? So 110 years later, right? Same mission, but talking about using data to do predictive safety instead of appliances to do safety. Now, when he told me about this idea, I remember sitting down for coffee and cranberry with him to talk about this idea. My first reaction, because remember my day job is a venture capitalist, my first reaction was like, that's awesome. We should learn a lot more about SaaS offerings for industrial safety. And we spent some time looking at it, but the problem is none of those startups, and I think there are great opportunities for startup innovation in this as well, but none of the startups trying to do these kinds of things come with 10,000 plus devices, right? And similarly, I think for UPMC, none of the 3 people startups inside, name your favorite accelerator, Y Combinator or whatever, come with the regulatory experience of someone like UPMC, right? And I think that's where you start to see these like, oh, wow, take the data, leverage the incumbency advantage that business brings to bear and create these new products. I guess, Pamela, maybe for you, like you have this unique thing, which is you're the chief analytics officer. So you're at the C-suite having these conversations.
Right.
How do you think about this conversation with your peers that, in the other C blank O roles in the organization?
Yeah, so, Gustavo and Rebecca and I, we're probably a little geeky around the edges. And we can get in the yes, and we can get in the weeds very quickly when we start talking about data. And when that happens, my C-suite peers are snoozing away. We can throw acronyms around. You cannot believe how many acronyms we know and can throw around all over the place. And nobody knows what we're talking about. So for me to engage my peers in the C-suite is I actually have a journalist who works for me. Think about that for a minute. Where do most people who occupy the C-suite, not us, but your CFO, your COO, your CEO, name your C, where do they get their information? It's not a number 2 font table, I can assure you.
Mm-hmm.
They get it from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Forbes magazine, the something business something, right? It's all been filtered through a professional journalist. So when we go to communicate with the C-suite, we have to communicate in a way that they are accustomed to and can ingest, which is not a 55-page report with half of them are number 2 font tables. That we're done here, folks. They don't have the time. So it really is about storytelling, and it is about data-driven narratives. And it's also very much about visualizing data. Show me a picture. That's how I communicate with my peers over the value of data and data analytics in the organization. It's not going into the weedy greedies of how we did this predictive model, and then we identified these people, and this was the sensitivity and specificity, and oh my God, they're all snoozing.
Yeah. Hiring journalists on the data science team. That's a new one, I suspect.
Well, actually, if I can comment on that, communication and being able to turn this really complicated, these data models and these results into actionable things that can turn into either your customers going to adopt them or you're going to be able to leverage them to make decisions for the enterprise. That's such a valuable skill. I mean, it doesn't really even matter how good my fancy data science, neural network, deep learning models are. If nobody understands what comes out of them and can put them into play, then it doesn't really matter how good the models were in some sense. I'm co-leading a National Academy study right now on, it's in progress. So I'll just loosely call it, it's just about upskilling data training with respect to a very large and complicated workforce. And over again, when we talk to industries who are in this area, or when we talk to government organizations in this area, they say that for some of those C blank O people that you were talking about, they really think the data engineers are kind of over in a room and the door is shut and like magic happens behind, the thing. And then there's no communication and that there's not a lot of work on that communication with the silos. And I would to all of our attendees here who are working in the startup space or thinking about how to leverage these data products, get those data conversations going. Grab those journalists, grab people who can interpret and talk in between. You're going to skyrocket on your ability to leverage kind of the value, extract value from the data. If you do have that emphasis on communication, I completely agree with Pamela. I think she's kind of a genius for hiring a journalist. Lots of schools of data science are starting to do this. They're starting to hire journalists. Christy Ashwandan, who used to be the lead science writer for 538, is now and she writes for the New York Times, and she's a freelance writer now. But if you want to look her up, she has gobs and gobs of articles about taking really complicated data stories and turning them into things for the public. She's excellent at that. If you want to get some ideas of how that's best managed, yeah.
I guess I'll chime in real quick. Just give from the industrial side, and obviously we manufacture product services and things like that people use. One of the things, some years ago, we actually launched a product that had a neural network. The device actually had a neural network for false alarm rejection. And quite frankly, the message totally got lost because we had the models and we were showing how it did it and everything. Nobody cared. Absolutely nobody cared. And we totally lost, a lot of the audience with it because it just became so complex and so intimidating. So, another thing is you're, talking about, more probably in the B2B side of world, or as you're showing the value of the data can provide. Another side of it is, and depends on who you're talking to as well, but the storytelling, designers, UX, all of that really matters. I mean, I think the underlying things that you're doing with the data, I'm not saying, obviously it's important. They got to be very robust, but you have a tendency of people to just believe the story to get you to buy the product, right? They get you to buy the service. And then the proof is in the pudding once they're using the device. But it's so hard to get that initial sale. What we're investing in that storytelling, certainly from a consumer perspective, is so critical for you to actually get the customers on the finish line. I can tell you, just our little startup, even though I thought it was going to be a lot easier because we're a 100-year-old company, we sell all sorts of products, have great relationships. Getting our first customer, I thought I was going to pass out frustration, how long it took us to get one customer. So once you get to that, it's very, very, but getting to that is super important. So I would just highly encourage everybody here to really invest. Journalists are great, depending on who you're talking to, but also designers. A lot of things you can do out there. A lot of freelance folks out there if you're trying to keep the cost down as well.
Yeah, so the piece here is, the UPMC is a big organization. Enterprises is our investment in startup. We don't invest in anything we wouldn't use. So we know what the problems are. We're in the trenches every day. We are a payer. We are a big hospital, physician provider system. We know what the industry problems are. We are solving our problems. If we solve our problems, everybody else has got the same problem too. I don't care how unique we like to think we are. And so what is really advantageous for us, that Gustavo's piece, is we are the first customer. We're not investing or standing up anything that's not solving a problem that we have. When we do that, we put it in our doctors' hands, in our hospitals, in our providers, in our payer system, in our whatever. We are solving our problem. So we become the beta customer. And once we have solved our problem, we can go to market.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for people who are like, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to learn more about that. Like basically all of tomorrow is a conversation on that exact riff, for what, not UPMC specifically, but generally this, how do you get the first customer? How to early customer input, impact innovation, all of those topics. Because I think, and I actually, not surprisingly, beyond UPMC, we've got folks from J&J, folks from United Healthcare Group, right? It's not folks from Phil's Restaurants. It's not surprising. I think this is an area where there is a lot that the rest of the world can learn from our friends in the healthcare space, because like that 0 to 1 is important across the board, right? Gustavo experienced that 0 to 1 for Safetyio, but 0 to 1 in healthcare is exponentially more important.
It's complicated.
Yeah, exactly. We have a bunch of questions from the audience, and please
can I just drop one thing in before?
Sure, of course. Yep.
I just wanted to say just really quickly that I think what you're hearing a lot from Gustavo and Pamela that I just wanted to draw attention to is that it's not really data-driven decision-making. It's far more data-informed decision-making. That, that the person, the customer, people are center with your data product. And that oftentimes people hear the phrase data-driven decision-making, like the data are doing everything. And that's not what's happening at all with anything that we're seeing. It's really, how can the data inform the decision-making that's happening by the customer, by the company, by whomever, so that's kind of the right way to think about that that interaction between the people and the data.
And then the way that you sell that, the influence, was exactly right, is how much does the data influence the decision that the company is making? And if the answer is all this data, we produce tons of it, oh my gosh, if all this data doesn't influence the company's decision making, then the company is wasting their money on me for sure, and I'm wasting my time. So the influence on the decisions, it is data-driven, data-informed, not data-driven. It's data-informed, and it's meant to influence the decisions, the business decisions of the company to make it smarter. So if we're not making the company smarter, I don't care how fast you do it, you're just making them stupid faster.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, she's nailed that.
Yeah, I could not agree more. It's actually in 2016 when we did the research that ultimately became Science of Growth. That was one of the 5 sustainable best practices we saw across all the startups that outperformed, was this data informed, not data driven decision making process. I do want to get to Sue's question, even though I feel like we may have mistaken this should maybe just been a 4-hour panel. But I do want to get to Sue's question. So she wants to know, how does what the C-suite communicates internally or externally found the kinds of problems you or anyone empowered to innovate in your organizations try to solve through innovation, or how you innovate?
So, I guess I'll start, at least from my perspective. It probably, at least in an organization like MSA that manufactures goods and you're selling it to customers, I guess from our perspective, it balances in the terms from a liability perspective, right? So depending on how far you want to get into, from a safety side of things, right? I mean, you can get into predicting an accident before it happens. And depending on where you are, certainly with the litigious society that we live in and everything around that, that's probably something where, you are bound in terms of how deep you want to take it into, say you're providing something to an ExxonMobil, and you certainly don't want to be somebody called in a lawsuit in case there's an explosion or things like that were to occur. But for the most part, really, our innovation is very customer driven, right? So it does start with that customer issue. At least aside from the, again, that side of the liability side of things, we do have a lot of free reign in terms of how we do that. We do then have to work on how to how to message that, just obviously for the different audiences, like I mentioned. But at least at a company like MSA, it doesn't bound it as much, other than don't get so deep into it that our lawyers are going to have all sorts of crazy things if the probability of one actually happens and you have a black swan event.
Yeah, makes sense. Pamela, Rebecca, anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that oftentimes, I think it's a really good question, Sue. And one of the common themes that I see in all of the partners that we work with at Carnegie Mellon is that answer can depend on how the data science core or the data science group is situated in the company. Yeah. So, for example, in some enterprises, the data group, I'm just going to use that phrase loosely. It could be a core, it could be a division, whatever. I'll just call it the data group. The data group is more of like a skunk works and is given all kinds of autonomy and essentially given the mandate to innovate. Go find some data products, see what exists in there, like go crazy. And we have worked with those types of setups. And in that case, the C-suite is mostly saying, don't completely blow your budget. Tell us what you come back with, kick the tires around, right? Like check it out and see what's going on. Some enterprises have their data group integrated fully in across the enterprise, where the data people are treated a little bit more like I almost might call a ticketing system. Like someone puts in a ticketing request and says, like, can you run me an analytics thing? So it's more like they're generating analytics reports. And in that case, the work that they're doing is extremely driven by the business problems that the other divisions are doing. And in that case, the C-suite may be communicating down to that business problem, and the data people are just supporting whatever that business problem is. So Gustavo was talking a little bit about how it's first driven by the customer, right? The customer need and the customer innovation there. So I think some of the research that's been coming out is suggesting that the optimal situation, particularly for a large enough company, would actually be to have both. To have data integrated throughout, but then also have a kind of a centralized, pulled out data where they're able to connect as a group outside, but then also support, because then you get kind of the best of both worlds. There's more overhead, of course, from a management perspective, and you have to figure out logistics and infrastructure, but that helps you optimize a lot. And in that case, the C-suite, from what I've seen from our partners, the C-suite is giving, in some sense, some mandate to innovate to that external data group, and then the other types of problems that they're solving are very driven by the business. So again, just that hybrid that I was talking about.
Right. That's exactly
what's best for your enterprise. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rebecca, that's exactly what we do. We call it a hub and spoke.
Yeah.
So we have a centralized, very innovative, unstructured, loosely structured group of very high level scientists and statisticians and epidemiologists and all sorts of people who do innovative. People can't ask us for something if they can't visualize what it is. Mm-hmm. So we create stuff people have never even thought about. And then we put it into organizations. But all through the organizations, we have these little pockets of reporting groups, which really are counting and reporting and doing some mild analytics. They're all spokes. Those spokes all come into the central piece. So the central piece might make some new innovation. Momentum is something we made a couple of years ago. It is the density of the service that you're using times the rate at which you use services. It runs off RVUs, actually. Hence, it's mass times velocity, hence momentum. We cook that up, and now we just export it out. And we don't, the innovation piece goes on and innovates again. So it's the best of both. It's a hybrid model. It's the best of both worlds. Mm-hmm. But you have to have a large enough organization to do it. Otherwise, you can't make a large enough hub. Yep. The hub has about 40 people in it.
Yeah. So a mid-sized organization like where we are at MSA, right, it probably wouldn't make sense for us to go that deep into it. So I think you have to just understand where you are and how you play and what data sets you also have.
Yeah. Yeah. Good data analytics is not for the weak of wallet.
Yeah, I would just advocate for if you are not a large enough organization yet to have enough resources, right, to create that hub, that you don't just completely isolate your data people though by themselves, because they're the lonely data scientists that are expected to do everything by themselves, sitting in some small cubicle somewhere, and it's just never going to work. But they need to be collaborating, right? They need to be communicating, right? It needs to be kind of that's the best way to optimize kind of the value that's going back and forth. So if you do have a smaller group, I still would have the data people communicating and collaborating and connecting with very strongly the other groups in the enterprise.
Awesome. We've got another one from Corentin. Maybe we can start with you, Gustavo, and then have Pamela or Rebecca add if they want. But he wants to know, once an idea to use data in a new way is identified, what are the steps / the process to implement it? Consumer validation, prototyping, MVPs, all that kind of stuff.
So we do a lot of prototyping, right? So one of the things that we end up doing, and you can build it fairly easily, we do have a captive audience with some of our customers that, fortunately use a lot of our products. So we do a lot of testing with them. We'll go with them, for example, one of the hot topics in health and safety that is, physiological monitoring, right? Right now, if you go to a refinery or places like that, people walking around, they're not being monitored like that. But we know that eventually that's going to happen. So creating prototypes of how these data sets and what insight and what business problem they solve. We do that way before we would put any resources whatsoever on our cloud development or our device connectivity or anything like that. So we do spend a lot of time on that, and you have to have enough of a representative size, obviously, and then once you start hearing kind of the same things, you obviously move on.
Yeah, definitely. So we work on my first piece is you get something really innovative, like Momentum was an innovative idea, came from within the Skunk Works. It doesn't do anything if the organization can't ingest it into its work process. And organizations, MSA is a good example, UPMC is certainly a good example, are complicated animals with lots of work processes and tons of regulation. You can't just arbitrarily go change something. We're a highly regulated industry, both on the payer and the provider side. So no matter how brilliant what you did, the very first thing you have to do is flow out the work process, the workflow process that you think that this innovation belongs in, and figure out if it actually can be ingested into the existing workflow. If it can, fully, you've got a good chance of actually getting something in use. If it can't, snoozer.
That's great. Okay, we've got 3 minutes, which means each of you get a minute to answer this question as we wrap up, which is, in what ways do you think data science is most misunderstood today? And we're going to ask the number one data science program in the country to kick us off, Rebecca.
Yeah, my answer is going to come back to what we were talking about earlier, which is a lot of people associate data science with very technical coding, with very complicated software packages, technical infrastructure, et cetera. And that does exist as part of the data science or the data life cycle. But there are so many parts of the data life cycle and solving problems using data science that are about people and are about understanding what they need, how they communicate, how they make decisions, how they're going to how they're going to look at a graph and decide what they see. This is really the behavioral part of data science is actually far more important in my view than me just hiring 15 amazing coders. I mean, that's great to have, but you're not really going to optimize all of your value if you don't think about that entire process. So for me, it's going to come back to making people front and center as part of working with data.
Awesome. Gustavo, how about you? And then we'll have Pamela, you go last.
So I know we don't have a lot of time. I couldn't agree more with you, Rebecca. I mean, I think all the things you said about the behaviors are super important, right? So I go back to the example of, we were using data science to solve a particular problem that we knew was an issue, but how we communicated and how we did it, and we didn't end up having, the market success that we thought we probably deserved. And it wasn't really until we changed it to really look at, the behaviors and making it really customer driven to talk about what customer outcome we're going to affect. With the data science algorithms and everything that we have in there, and being able to pinpoint our team into what problem sets you really want to go after. I think that's really the most critical, so that you actually have a path to solve something that's a little bit more tangible than trying to boil the ocean.
Awesome. Yeah. And last but certainly not least, Pamela, we'll let you get the last word.
Sure. I think it's the most misunderstood piece around data science is that it's some really complicated voodoo that goes on in a black box. And in fact, we're doing whatever it is we're doing. In fact, it is both simpler, way simpler than most people think, and it's way harder. And there's not much to do. It's kind of empty. It's a little bimodal distribution. So we do things that are really complicated and hard with machine learning, but most of what we do that actually brings serious value to an organization is relatively simple. People just need to know. You can't manage what you can't see. You're managing some kind of risk. If you can't even quantify the risk that's sitting on the table, how in the world are you going to manage that? So we don't think about data scientists in that piece, but the best piece of data scientists that I have is the ability to visualize data. So like that, I can get the C-suite to see what the problem is and where the pinpoint is, and that this is a process problem, not a data problem.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think this was a great finish to the first day. For the attendees, we're going to do this at the end of each day. Again, as we're trying to get as much from in-person events and make it happen online. We're going to just take 10 minutes and Lou Masanti, my colleague, is just going to do content weaving. So when I end this meeting, you'll be able to jump over to a session with Lou where he walks you through some of the takeaways from the first day. That'll go about 10 minutes. And then the sessions will resume again tomorrow in Run the World at 1 p.m. Eastern with John Santelli. So talk to you guys again tomorrow. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
All right, thanks, take care.